Lydia Harrow had never spoken more than 6 words to Elias Crane. And yet, for 8 years, she'd loved him with a silence so patient it nearly hardened into prayer. She was 17 when it began, on the day her father was buried. Elias had stood beside the coffin in his mourning coat, adjusting the floral arrangements with the care of a man who believed the dead still noticed beauty. He hadn't looked at her then. He never really had since. The funerals came often in their village, and Lydia, by all accounts, had grown accustomed to death. Or rather, she'd grown accustomed to his presence within it. Elias was always there, black-gloved, silent, reverent. He held grief the way a violinist holds a bow, not with detachment, but with practiced control. He moved like one who knew how easily a body could break, and how often a heart already had. She watched him without expectation. She'd made peace with that early on. Her love, if it could be called that, asked for nothing. She stitched mourning veils for widows, attended the services of those she barely knew, and left before the dirt hit the lid. Some women cried for the dead. Lydia mourned the living man, who never once looked her way. It might have continued like that, quiet and suspended, if not for Charlotte. Her cousin returned from London on a Tuesday in April, wearing a sky-blue bonnet and declaring herself bored to death. She swept through the house like perfume caught on wind, kissing cheeks, rolling eyes at provincial silence, and pausing just long enough to register Lydia's plain gray dress. "You haven't changed at all," she said, eyes gleaming. "Still pale, still soft-spoken, still dressing like a sympathy note." Lydia smiled faintly. "Welcome home." Charlotte's glance flicked toward the window. "Anyone worth watching in this town anymore? Anyone who's recently widowed or recently rich?" "Mrs. Elwood passed 2 nights ago," Lydia offered, folding fabric on the parlor table. "Oh, how tragic," Charlotte murmured, already smiling. "Do you suppose she left behind anything wearable?" "There's a funeral tomorrow." Charlotte brightened. "Perfect. I need a reason to wear this dreadful black hat." Charlotte turned to the mirror and adjusted the plume on her bonnet. "Besides, nothing makes a man more open to love than proximity to death. Who officiates these ceremonies now? Mr. Ward? And the undertaker?" Lydia tried to hide the tightening in her throat. "Still Mr. Crane and his son." Charlotte's lips curled with interest. "He had a son?" Lydia said nothing, but in her chest, something old and trembling stirred. The church filled slowly that afternoon. Lydia took her usual place, third pew, hands folded, eyes forward. She could hear Charlotte's quiet sigh behind her, as if mourning were a thing to be endured, not felt. When Elias entered, she did not dare turn her head, but she knew his footsteps by sound alone, measured, unhurried, respectful. He passed her aisle. Her heart quickened. He never looked her way. The service was brief. Mrs. Elwood had been elderly and beloved, but not in any dramatic fashion. There were no sobbing airs, no lingering regrets. When it ended, the congregation moved into the sunlight, scattering like petals from a wilted bouquet. Lydia remained on the chapel steps, feigning interest in the rose vines creeping up the old stone wall. She saw Elias ahead, hands folded behind his back as he spoke with the vicar. He looked like part of the earth, rooted, essential, unknowable. Charlotte, of course, had no such hesitation. She moved toward him with the confidence of a woman who had once been courted by a viscount and refused him twice. Lydia watched in helpless horror as Charlotte dropped her lace glove, an elegant accident, and Elias bent to retrieve it. Their eyes met. They exchanged words, polite ones surely. Lydia couldn't hear any of it, but she felt something collapse in her chest, silent and heavy. Later that evening, as Lydia worked on a mourning veil for a widow with 3 sons, Charlotte burst into her room uninvited. "You're Mr. Crane," she said, spinning a ribbon between her fingers, has the softest voice I've ever heard. Deep, but not rehearsed. Do you know he called my glove delicate? Lydia didn't look up from her stitches. He was being polite. I know, but I liked it. I told him we might need a casket soon for my fashion sense, because I'm positively dying in these provincial styles. He laughed. Imagine that. Mr. Crane laughed. Lydia bit her lip. You should speak to him sometime, Charlotte added. Lydia said nothing. That night, she stood at her window and watched the mist gather over the hill where the graveyard rested. Somewhere among the headstones, Elias would be working, marking a plot, measuring dimensions, perhaps carving an initial into stone. He was always preparing something final, and Lydia couldn't help but wonder if love, too, was something he handled with gloves. She still remembered the sound of his voice once, 4 years ago. After her father's burial, she had stood by the gate alone, shaking from grief and rain. Elias had approached without speaking, removed his coat, and placed it over her shoulders before vanishing back into the dark. He never spoke her name, never asked for the coat back. She had stitched it shut into her wardrobe, seams and all. The next morning brought another complication. Her aunt, hearing of Charlotte's boldness, was thrilled. Elias Crane may not be titled, but undertakers are always needed. His father's business is respectable. A man who keeps to himself is far better than one who gallivants. Lydia stirred her tea. You're of marrying age, too, her aunt added without a glance. But no man wants a girl with nothing to say. Charlotte grinned across the table. Lydia saves her words for funerals. Lydia excused herself before her hands trembled too much to hold the cup. Later that afternoon, while collecting ribbons from the shop, Lydia overheard 2 ladies whispering about Elias. One claimed he was promised to someone already, though no one knew who. Another said he had turned down 2 offers this year alone. Lydia lingered in the doorway until the voices faded. Back home, she spread out her materials for a new veil, but her hands refused the rhythm. She reached instead for a sheet of writing paper, then paused. What would she say? I've loved you since 17. Number 2 dramatic. Do you remember giving me your coat? I never gave it back. Too desperate. She folded the paper blank and placed it in the fire. That night, Charlotte entered her room again. He's coming to supper, she said simply. Lydia turned. Elias? Charlotte nodded, already admiring herself in the mirror. I invited him. I told him you'd be there too. Lydia gripped the edge of the vanity. And he said yes. Charlotte smiled. He said he'd try. Lydia looked out the window again, toward the cemetery ridge. Tomorrow, the man who never looked her way would be sitting across her table. And her cousin, the one who never stayed silent, would be sitting beside him. The supper table gleamed beneath the glow of 2 candles, and Charlotte's ambition. Lydia had polished the silver twice, not for Elias, but because her hands had refused to be still. The moment he entered, she felt every nerve in her spine stand to attention. He bowed politely, his dark coat damp at the hem from the earlier drizzle, and offered their aunt a bouquet of wild violets, which he'd picked himself, claiming not to have known whether formal arrangements were appropriate. Lydia thought it was the gentlest thing anyone had said all week. Charlotte made herself the star. Before he even sat down, she spoke of London's theatre scene, of oysters that made her ill for a fortnight, of a gentleman who'd proposed during a fireworks display, and whom she declined for being too forward. Elias listened with steady attention, his hands never leaving his lap. His replies short, but gracious. Lydia tried to find some flaw in her cousin's delivery, but Charlotte was skilled, each smile timed, each laugh effortless. She had made a performance of charm, and Elias was her captive audience. Lydia could not swallow more than a mouthful. She watched Elias from the end of the table, memorizing the way his brow lifted slightly when Charlotte mentioned morning fashion, the way his eyes moved, not often to Charlotte, but toward the candles, the silver, and once across the table toward Lydia. It had only lasted a moment, but she had seen it. She was sure of it, unless Hope had learned to mimic memory, and she was simply borrowing comfort from her imagination again. After the second course, the conversation turned toward work. "I imagine it's difficult," Charlotte said, her tone artfully subdued, "to be surrounded by grief every day. Doesn't it weigh on you?" Elias set his fork down. "It depends," he said. "Some mourners are full of sorrow. Others are full of performance. Grief itself is quiet. It's people who are loud." Lydia felt the air shift. Charlotte paused, perhaps unsure whether that had been a compliment or a rebuke. Elias took a sip of water. Lydia's heart tripped in her chest. When the meal concluded, their aunt insisted Elias remain for tea. He did, though Lydia noticed him glance toward the window, as though already preparing to leave. Charlotte fetched the tin herself and made a show of dropping sugar cubes with perfect precision. "Do you ever get used to losing people?" she asked. Elias did not flinch. He met her gaze, his voice calm. "Number, but you can become practiced at being useful." "Useful," Charlotte repeated, as if the word intrigued her. "That's such a humble goal." "It's enough for me," he said simply. The clock ticked too loudly. Lydia wondered if it was always this loud, or if grief simply made silence more honest. Elias eventually stood, excusing himself with a quiet nod and a thank you. Charlotte followed him to the door, and Lydia remained seated, hands in her lap. The front door opened, closed. Her cousin's footsteps returned with a note of triumph. He said it was a lovely evening. Lydia didn't respond. "He noticed the embroidery on my sleeve, said it was the same stitch used on certain burial cloths." "Because it is," Lydia said. Charlotte tilted her head. "You don't seem pleased." "I'm tired," Lydia replied. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She was exhausted, yes, but not from the evening, from holding herself back every hour of it, from watching the man she loved respond to another woman's light while ignoring her stillness. She rose and excused herself. In her room, she opened the wardrobe, reached for the old coat Elias had once draped over her shoulders. She laid it on the bed, hands flat across the seams she'd stitched shut years ago. The next morning, Lydia visited the chapel alone. She did not wear black, though she often did. Today she wore gray, the soft shade between resignation and habit. She sat in the third pew and closed her eyes, letting the hush of the space settle around her like a shroud. She stayed there for a long time, waiting for her pulse to calm. Footsteps eventually broke the silence. Familiar, careful. She turned. Elias stood in the aisle, holding a book beneath one arm. "Miss Harrow," he said softly. She nodded. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No," he replied. "This place is never truly empty." He stepped closer, then paused. "I wanted to thank you. The supper was kind." Lydia swallowed. "It was Charlotte who arranged it." "I know. But it was you who kept the table steady." She looked up sharply. He offered a faint smile. "I meant the conversation. You listened. Carefully. Not many do." Lydia's breath hitched. "I always listen," she said. "I know," he replied. Before she could speak again, he handed her the book. "It belonged to your father. I only just came across it while clearing the chapel shelves. I thought you might want it." She opened the cover. Her father's handwriting, neat and steady. She blinked quickly. "Thank you." Elias inclined his head and left before she could say more. Lydia remained in the pew with the book in her lap, pages trembling beneath her fingertips. When she returned home, Charlotte was waiting. "He's quiet," her cousin said without turning from the mirror. "But he's watching." "Watching what?" Lydia asked. "Me," Charlotte said with a satisfied smirk. I think I've almost broken through. Men like him, they don't need conversation. They need warmth, eye contact, a little pressure. Lydia felt her lungs tighten. You're not a performance. No, Charlotte agreed. I'm the finale. That night, Lydia sat awake while the house slept. She opened her journal, wrote Elias's name once, then crossed it out. She left the room only when she heard movement below. The grandfather clock struck midnight. She descended the staircase slowly. At the foot of it, just beyond the parlor, stood Elias, wet from rain, eyes stormlit, hands trembling. I shouldn't be here, he said. Lydia didn't move. Then why are you? I couldn't sleep. Neither could I. His eyes searched hers. Then, without explanation, he turned and walked toward the door. Good night, Miss Harrow. Good night, she whispered, but she didn't sleep after that either. Lydia did not tell Charlotte that Elias had come to the house at midnight. She didn't mention the way his voice trembled, or the way his eyes searched hers like a man afraid to believe in kindness. She simply folded her blanket, combed her hair, and acted as though nothing had changed, because nothing had. He had come, and he had left. He had not said her name with affection. He had not reached for her hand, and yet still, she was changed. Charlotte, meanwhile, became more radiant with each passing day. She arranged flowers for the vicar's table. She stitched a ribbon into her hair, in case Mr. Crane visits the chapel. She claimed to be reading poetry about mortality, but quoted none of it. Lydia watched it unfold the way one watches a storm building on the sea, certain it will reach the shore, and equally certain no one will call it what it is until it begins to drown them. On Thursday, Lydia was delivering a mourning veil to the widow Rawlins when she saw Elias again. He stood outside the milliner's, speaking with the seamstress's son. His coat was wet at the collar, and a black book peeked from beneath his arm. Lydia would have walked on, but just as she passed, he turned. Miss Harrow, he said. The way he said it, measured, soft, sent a pulse through her ribs. Mr. Crane, she replied. A quiet day, only on the surface, he murmured. She smiled, unsure what he meant. He hesitated, then added, I've something for you, if you've time to walk a moment. Against her better judgment, Lydia nodded. She followed him up the hill path behind the old smithy, where the sky dripped rain between the tree limbs. He didn't speak at first. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that felt like a hand being held too carefully to crush. Finally, he offered the book. I found this with your father's papers. He wrote something inside it. Lydia opened the cover, and her breath caught. In her father's hand were the words, For my Lydia, who sees what others forget to look at. Her vision blurred. I didn't know this existed, she whispered. Elias kept his gaze on the road. He spoke of you often. Always, with pride. You knew him? I was young, but yes. He asked my father to hire me. Said I was a boy who needed order. He was right. Lydia pressed the book to her chest. She wanted to ask why Elias had kept this for so long, but feared the answer would unravel her. At the bottom of the path, they stopped beneath a bent tree, whose trunk curved like a bowed violin. I never thanked you for your kindness after his funeral, she said. Elias shook his head. There's nothing to thank. I remember what it is to lose someone you can't replace. So do I, she said, and immediately regretted it. But he didn't flinch. He only nodded, eyes distant. Miss Harrow, he said after a moment, do you think it's possible to miss something you never truly had? Her breath hitched. I think that's the only kind of missing that never heals. He looked at her then, really looked, and she had to force herself to breathe. The wind stirred between them. The air smelled of lilac and wet stone. You were right, he said finally, about grief being quiet. She blinked. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. They parted with a quiet nod. Lydia carried the book home with trembling fingers. She placed it on her dresser and did not open it again that day. Charlotte, of course, was waiting. "You look flushed," she said, without looking up from her embroidery. Did the widow cry? "I didn't see her." "Oh?" Lydia said nothing. Charlotte set her needle down and turned. "You saw him again, didn't you?" Lydia met her gaze. "Briefly. Did he say anything of use?" "He gave me something of my father's." Charlotte arched a brow. "How thoughtful of him. Perhaps you'll start exchanging relics." That night, Charlotte brought up a new idea: hosting a small musical gathering. "Not a ball, heavens no," she said, "but a few young men and women. The piano, a few hymns, just enough to remind Mr. Crane that he is alive." "He's always known he's alive," Lydia replied. Charlotte smiled, "But I intend to make him feel it." 3 days later, the parlor was filled with fresh flowers and women who spoke too loudly. Lydia sat by the window, stitching in silence, while Charlotte entertained the room like a performer mid-rehearsal. Elias arrived late. He stood just inside the door for a long moment before bowing. He was handsome in a way only someone full of sorrow could be: quiet, deliberate, untouchable. Lydia caught his eye across the room. Her hand froze on the fabric. He was drawn toward the piano, where Charlotte waited. They spoke in low tones. Charlotte placed her fingers on the keys, played a gentle melody, and asked him to name it. "It's a funeral hymn," he said plainly. The room quieted. Charlotte didn't falter. "I thought it sounded lovely." "It is," he said, "but it's not meant for rooms with this much perfume." A ripple of laughter followed, but Lydia heard the edge in his voice. A man pulled too far from his element. When he stepped away from the piano, Lydia rose. She met him near the hallway, her voice low. "You don't have to stay." He studied her. "Neither do you. I live here." "So do I," he murmured. She didn't understand, until he added, "At least tonight." Before she could respond, Charlotte appeared, linking her arm through his. "Come, Mr. Crane. You haven't yet heard me play properly." He allowed her to guide him, but glanced back. Just once. Toward Lydia. That glance stayed with her, long after the last guest left, long after Charlotte declared it a successful evening, long after the candles died. Lydia sat at the foot of her bed, fingers resting on her father's book, and whispered to no one, "What if he's only looking at me when he thinks I'm not looking back?" The next morning, a parcel arrived, wrapped in linen. No note. Inside was a pressed lily, and beneath it, a glove. Not Charlotte's, Lydia's, lost at a funeral 2 years before. She held it like a letter that said too much, without saying anything at all. She had imagined many things he might remember, but not this. A glove. A flower. Silence dressed as a confession. Her heart, already full, had nowhere left to hide. The glove lay folded beside the pressed lily, as if someone had tucked a memory into the present. Lydia turned it over twice, before placing it gently into her drawer. She didn't need to guess who had returned it. She knew the way Elias's silence felt, and this silence was his, careful, deliberate, and steeped in meaning. He hadn't signed a note. He hadn't needed to. The gesture was a whisper, and Lydia had always been fluent in whispers. She didn't speak of it to Charlotte, not when her cousin recounted the success of her gathering, not when she mentioned inviting Elias to the next one, not even when she boasted that he had walked her to the gate. Lydia simply listened, nodding when expected, as if her heart hadn't jolted at the thought of him standing near that piano, thinking of funeral hymns while the world tried to sing love songs around him. 3 days passed. The rain returned, drumming softly against the windows, as if reminding her what silence sounded like. Lydia busied herself with lacework, with letters, with anything that would stop her from rereading the note her father had once scribbled inside the book Elias had returned. "For my Lydia, who sees what others forget to look at." She wondered if Elias had read it, if he had thought of her while holding it. if he had finally begun to see her. He came again, just before dusk. No warning, no reason. She found him at the garden gate, hands in his coat pockets, eyes cast toward the hedge. He looked up when she stepped outside, and the sight of him, wet at the shoulders, uncertain in posture, struck her like a wind she hadn't prepared for. "I shouldn't come uninvited," he said softly, "but I didn't want the glove to say more than I intended." She stepped closer. "And what did you intend it to say?" He hesitated. "That I remember things I had no right to keep." She held his gaze. "You gave me your coat once. I kept it for 8 years. Does that make us even?" "Not quite," he said gently, "but it makes us something." The words settled between them like a blessing. Lydia's breath trembled in her chest. Elias stepped inside the gate and closed it softly behind him. "I've always spoken too late," he said, "or not at all. I don't want to do that anymore." She nodded. "Then speak now," she whispered. "If you're going to." He looked at her like she was a verse he'd memorized long ago and had only just dared to say aloud. "I remember the funeral where the Duchess shouted because her veil wasn't violet, and you offered her yours without question." His voice was low, steady. "You stood beside her, humiliated, while everyone else stared." Lydia blinked. "You noticed that?" He continued. "There was the winter burial, when you walked 2 old widows home in the sleet, and gave them your umbrella. You were drenched by the time you returned. You caught a draft." She stared at him, breath caught. "The apothecary said someone had delivered medicine to the door, but he never said who." Elias stepped closer. "That was me." Lydia's lips parted, but no sound came. "I've been watching you for years," he said. "Not out of habit, but because you made the most heartbreaking things feel almost bearable. And I never found the words." He reached for her hand, then brought her fingers to his chest and held them there. "But this has belonged to you longer than I've had the courage to admit." She swallowed, heart shaking in her ribs. "I never expected you to say any of this. That's why it matters," he said. She lowered her gaze. "I've always admired you. From a distance. Perhaps too carefully." "I know," he murmured. "And I'm sorry I made you wait." He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But the way he looked at her, quietly undone, openly sure, was more intimate than any touch, like he was offering her a life with his eyes alone. They stood in the quiet together, and she no longer felt alone in the story she had been carrying for so long. Later, she would write his name in her journal and not cross it out. Later, she would sit beside him in church, not because she was mourning, but because she had someone to sit with now. And when people asked how it happened, how the undertaker's son and the mourning girl came to fall in love, she would say only, "One of us was always watching." The other finally looked back. And when Elias asked her, weeks later, beneath the same bent tree, if she would walk beside him for all the days they were given, even if some of those days were spent burying others, she would not hesitate. "Yes, Elias, you buried the dead, but you carried me all along."
You stood in black by my father's grave. I watched your hands the whole time they prayed. You touched the lilies like they still knew what beauty meant when seen by you. You never spoke, but I still heard each silence like a written word. 8 years gone and still I stay in pews and paths you walked that day. You passed me once in chapel light. Your shoulders brushed the edge of mine. I stitched your name in mourning thread and wore it quiet while they wept. I watched you mark where others rest, while hiding love beneath my dress. Each veil I made, each prayer I kept, was for a man who never wept. 8 years silent, 8 years near, loving you through every grief I appeared. You never saw me, you never knew, but I was the girl who always loved you. My cousin laughed and caught your eye. I watched her try while I sat shy. She dropped her glove, I dropped my breath. You bent for her like love was death. Still I stayed with folded hands, invisible like all the land that bloomed around the ones you laid and carried home in velvet shade. 8 years silent, 8 years true, loving you through every vow stitched in blue. You never asked me, you never guessed, but I was the girl who never loved less. Maybe love is what you bear, not what you speak, but what you